Somewhere right now, a farmer is staring at soil that used to be a field. The cracks run so deep you can lose a hand in them. The well is dry, the crop is gone, and he doesn't know how he's going to feed his family next month. We talk about climate change as if it's a future problem, a graph, a degree on a thermometer, something that happens to polar bears and coastlines. But America already lived through it, in living memory, on its own soil, and it came not from a factory or a pipeline, but from a plow. This is the story of the Dust Bowl, the decade when the sky turned black. Millions of Americans lost everything, and the richest farmland in the world became a wasteland. And it's a story we urgently need to relearn, because we're making the same mistakes all over again. To understand the Dust Bowl, you have to understand what came before it. For thousands of years, the Great Plains, stretching from Texas up through the Dakotas, was covered in a thick mat of native grasses, buffalo grass, bluestem, grama. These grasses had roots that went 6 feet deep. They held the soil like a fist. They survived floods, fires, drought, and blizzards. They were, in a word, indestructible. Then came World War I. Europe needed wheat. America had land. The federal government urged farmers to plow everything they had. Wheat prices soared from 35 cents a bushel to over $2. New mechanical tractors made it possible to break up land that had never been touched. Between 1910 and 1930, farmers tore up over 100 million acres of native grassland, an area the size of California. They called it the Great Plow-Up. They called the plains the Wheat Belt. They should have called it a time bomb. Because those grasses weren't just scenery, they were the only thing keeping the soil in place. In 1931, the rains stopped. Not a little, completely. Temperatures soared. The exposed topsoil, with nothing to hold it, began to move. At first it was just dust, a nuisance. Farmers figured the rains would come back, they always had. But the drought deepened. By 1934, dust storms were sweeping across the entire central United States. Ships 300 miles out in the Atlantic found dust on their decks. Dust settled on windowsills in Washington, D.C. A reporter coined a phrase that would define a decade, the Dust Bowl. The storms were like nothing anyone had ever seen. They called them black blizzards, walls of earth 2 miles high, traveling at 60 miles an hour. When one arrived, day turned to night in seconds. Animals suffocated. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Children developed a new condition doctors called dust pneumonia, their lungs filling slowly with silt. Some of them didn't survive. People stopped going outside. They stuffed wet rags under their doors. They slept with handkerchiefs over their faces, and still, in the morning, they'd wake up with a layer of fine red grit on their pillows. And then came Black Sunday. April the 14th, 1935, Easter weekend. The sky over the Texas Panhandle and Oklahoma was clear and warm, the nicest day in months. People were outside, children were playing. It felt finally like things might be okay. Then someone looked north. A wall of dust, 200 miles wide, a full mile high, was rolling across the plains like a slow-motion avalanche. Moving at 60 miles an hour, it swallowed towns whole. It turned afternoon into absolute darkness. People ran for their cars, for their homes, for anything solid. Some didn't make it. They were found later, suffocated, buried under drifts of dirt that reached the roof lines of houses. Black Sunday became the defining image of the Dust Bowl. But something else happened that day. Something quieter in Washington. A soil scientist named Hugh Hammond Bennett had been pleading with Congress for years to fund soil conservation. Nobody listened. On April 14th, he was mid-testimony when an aide slipped him a note. The Black Sunday storm had reached D.C. The sky outside the Capitol was turning brown. Bennett pointed to the window. "This, gentlemen," he said, "is what I have been talking about." The Soil Conservation Act passed within weeks. By the mid-1930s, 3.5 million people had been forced off their land. The Great Plains had become uninhabitable. They loaded everything they owned onto flatbed trucks and Model T Fords, mattresses, chickens, children, and they drove west, down Route 66 toward California, toward the promise of work, of fruit, of a new start. They were called Okies, a slur that stuck, whether they came from Oklahoma or Kansas or Texas or Colorado. California didn't want them. Border towns set up what they called bum blockades, armed guards who turned migrants back at the state line illegally. Farm camps were crowded, underpaid, disease-ridden. A young photographer named Dorothea Lange drove out to those camps to document what she saw. One afternoon in 1936, she stopped at a pea pickers camp in Nipomo, California. She photographed a woman sitting in a makeshift tent, her children pressing against her, her eyes fixed on something far away, or nothing at all. That photograph, Migrant Mother, became one of the most reproduced images in history. It put a face on what was happening, and John Steinbeck put words to it in The Grapes of Wrath. In the eyes of the people, there is the failure, and in the eyes of the hungry, there is a growing wrath. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal attacked the Dust Bowl on multiple fronts. The Soil Conservation Service taught farmers contour plowing along the natural curves of the land instead of in straight lines so water didn't run straight downhill and carry the soil with it. They promoted cover crops to protect bare ground between seasons. They paid farmers to take their worst land out of production. And FDR launched the Shelter Belt Project, one of the most ambitious reforestation efforts in American history. The government planted 220 million trees in a 100-mile wide band from North Dakota down to Texas, rows of elms, cottonwoods, and cedars designed to break the wind before it could pick up speed and carry the soil away. You can still see them today, running in long straight lines across the plains. The rains returned in the early 1940s. The land slowly recovered. The crisis was over. Or so it seemed. Beneath the Great Plains sits the Ogallala Aquifer, one of the largest underground freshwater reserves on Earth. It took 10,000 years to fill. Farmers discovered it in the 20th century and tapped into it to irrigate the same land that had blown away in the 1930s. It turned the plains green again. Today, it supplies 30% of all groundwater used for irrigation in the United States. We are draining it 9 times faster than it refills. In parts of Kansas and Texas, water levels have dropped by more than 150 feet. Scientists project that significant portions of the aquifer will be functionally exhausted within our lifetimes. Meanwhile, climate change is making the Great Plains hotter and drier than it was in the 1930s. The native grasses are still gone. The farms are still there. The warnings from soil scientists sound eerily familiar. Globally, an estimated 216 million people could be forced to migrate within their own countries by 2050 due to climate impacts, drought, flooding, crop failure. The United Nations calls them climate refugees. Steinbeck would have recognized them immediately. The Dust Bowl was not an act of God. It was an act of human choice, of short-term profit over long-term thinking, of ignoring the warnings embedded in the land itself. We learned from it, we built agencies, we planted trees, we changed how we farm, and then, slowly, over the decades, we forgot. History doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. The question is whether we'll recognize the melody in time.